Hello and welcome to Code Harvest. In this video, I'll be demonstrating step by step how you can create a carousel that never stops, even at the beginning and end points, and we are going to be using JavaScript to help us achieve this. This is part 1 of the tutorial. Check out part 2 in the pinned comment down below. Subscribe to Code Harvest if you've not already, and now let's start the video. Alright, so now once you have created the HTML file, we already included the document type, the language we're going to be writing the HTML file in, the HTML code in, the required meta tags, the title, the name of the website, we've called it Rosaline's, and once you've already linked in your style sheet as well as your JavaScript file, which right now they're completely empty, though we're going to be adding the code in soon, we're going to start with the HTML side of our slider. So first we are going to create an ID, and we're going to call this slider. So this will basically act as a container which will hold everything of the carousel. It will hold in the buttons that will move the slider from left to right, and we're also going to be adding the container that will contain all of the slide boxes, all of the slides. So now first we're going to create our two buttons for previous and for next. And right now, since we're only focusing on the creation of the carousel, we're not focusing on the design, we'll just add in arrow. So this one is going to be called previous button. So we're going to create a class, and now these two buttons should pretty much have the same design. However, they're just going to have different functionalities, so we're just going to put them both as the same class slide button. However, this one specifically is called the previous button, and then this one will be called next, and we'll just switch the arrows. Now in between these two buttons, we're going to add in the container that will hold all of the slide boxes. So we're going to create an ID for this, and it's going to be called all slides, any name that you'd like, and then we are going to now create all of the slide boxes from 1 to 10. Alright, so now we've included all of our slide boxes and our buttons all together. So now we are going to be creating the CSS side of our carousel. So when we check our HTML page, we can see that all of our images, the text in order to indicate what slide position it is, as well as the buttons are now visible. However, now we're just going to assign it to make sure that the flowers are, or the images are adjusted in one row rather than in a column that it is right now. And we're going to make the sizing, the container, a little bit smaller. So now the first thing that we want to do is we want to include a specific design for all elements in the page. So the first thing, so this identify basically selects all the elements, and the design that we want to apply, we apply it inside the curly brackets. So now the first thing we want is to remove any default spacing, because there are some elements that may have default margin spacing, meaning the spacing outside an element, and we don't want any of those extra spacing. The spacing we want it to be only from our side and not from the default. So we're also going to remove the padding spacing as well, so the inner spacing of an element. And then another thing is this font type is a little bit, it feels boring, so we're just going to change the font family to sans serif. So now that looks a little bit better. Now the first thing that we're going to work on is the slider, and because it is an ID, we'll select with a hashtag. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to control how much of the page that it takes up. So we're going to change the width. Alright, so now we want the slider to take about 60% of the page. We want the height to be 650 pixels, and we want to ensure that the button, the container that holds all of these slide boxes, and the other button, so both the buttons and the slide bar and the all slides container, they're in one line. So we're going to have to set a flexible layout with display flex, change the flex direction to ensure that it is in a row. We also want to ensure that all the items are placed towards the center vertically and also horizontally. And then another thing is we also want to add some inner spacing inside the container, and we're going to use 20 pixels, so 20 pixels on each side, top, left, right, and bottom as well. We want it to have 20 pixels, and then we just want to see how much of the page the container takes up of the page. So now we can see that all of the slide boxes are still not in a line because we haven't really changed the layout of the all slides container. However, we can see that the buttons as well as the overall container that holds all the slides are in one line. Alright, so now because we've added some padding spacing, we also want to reduce the width as well, because we want the width to be strictly 60%. However, because of the padding spacing, we've added 40 pixels because, this property adds 20 pixels towards the left, towards the right, top and bottom, but the height, we're not too strict on it. However, the width should be 60%, and so we're going to have to reduce this by 40 pixels because the left and right spacing are both 20 pixels each, so 20 plus 20, 40. So we're going to use this calculation function in order to ensure that the 40 pixels are not they're not added to the width, which we want it to be strictly of 60%. So now we have the width, so now the width is 60%, just that the padding spacing no longer affects the width or adds to the width. So now we're going to work on the next container, which is the all slides function, which directly holds all of the slide boxes. So now the first thing that we want to include is we want to create a flexible layout, and we want to ensure that the flex direction is in a row. Alright, so now we want our slide boxes to be towards the center. So for vertical center, we want to use place items and then justify content. We're going to specify that on it towards the center to ensure that the slide boxes are horizontally centered as well. Alright, so now we want the all slides container to take up 100% or the full width of the container of slider, and then we also want the height to be 100% as well. Now we want to add some margin spacing so that the carousel and the slide boxes look a little more neat. So we are adding this margin spacing or outside spacing towards between the container that holds all the slide boxes and the buttons, and so we're going to add this spacing of 20 pixels. Now because we're adding margin spacing of 20 pixels, the width and height are also affected because margin spacing is added towards the top, left, right, bottom. So we're going to have to use the calculation function once again and reduce the extra 40 pixels that margin spacing may bring, so that there's still a margin spacing seen, however it's not added. Alright, so now one more thing that we're going to do is we're going to add an indicator basically so that we can see where our container ends and starts. So we're going to add a border property 1 pixel. We want the line to be solid and we want it to be a different color than the container that we use. So we know that black is the slider container and green is the all slides container. Alright, so now we're going to be working on our slide boxes, and when we check our HTML5 we can see that we have used a class in order to create our slide boxes. So we're going to use a dot, and now which selects classes. So now we are going to start with creating a flexible layout so that we can ensure that our text and that our images are centered, and with that we are gonna have to use a flexible layout. However, we want the text to be on top of each other, the text and the image to be on top of each other, not next to each other. So we're going to keep the flex direction to be in a column and not in a row this time, and then we want to ensure that everything is centered horizontally and vertically. Now we're going to add a transition from a slide box being shown and a slide box being hidden, and that is only, and using display flex and setting it to display none to hide it will not create a smooth transition, and we don't want that. We want the transition to be much more smoother. So we want to use the width in order to show and hide a slide box, which will create a smooth transition, and that's what we want. So we're going to set the width for now to 0, and slide boxes that will have an active class, which we will sort out in JavaScript, will have the full width. And then the height is not really important, so we'll keep it automatic. And then we also want we want to specify how smooth the transition should be, and it should be of 0.4 seconds. And in both ways, when the slide box is the width is 0 and it's changed to full width, and also vice versa when it is full width and it's changed to 0 being hidden. And now the next thing that we want to do is we want to select the image, and we want to ensure that the image fits properly into the slide box. And so we're going to select the image which is in the slide box, and we want the width and height to be to take up the full width and height of the slide box. The width that we're going to specify, we want it to take 100% of that, height as well, and we want to ensure that the object does not look stretched or shrunk. So we're going to use this property object fit, and to ensure that the image is contained in the slide box and it's not enlarged or anything like that. Alright, so now we're done with the CSS side of our carousel, so now we're going to be working on our the JavaScript aspect. So we've created a file called carousel handler, and we've already linked it in our HTML file here. So now the first thing that we want to do is create a domain for basically making sure that everything in the document has been processed, the elements that are in the document, the structure that we've created, etc. So we're going to add an event listener towards the document, and the event that it should listen for is whether everything in the document has been loaded. And once everything has been loaded, then we can create an arrow function and the following can be executed. Alright, so now the first thing we want to do is we want to select the slide container. We want to collect an array of all the slide boxes. We want to select the buttons, and we're going to be acting upon them. So first thing that we want to do is collect the slides container, and we're going to use query selector, and we're going to select it just like we do in CSS. And for the container that holds all of the slides, not everything including the button but just all the slides, is called all slides. So we'll just close this file now. and because it is an ID, we've selected with a hashtag just like in CSS and the name of the ID. So now the next thing we want to do is select all of the slides, so the array of all slides. So we're going to use query selector all in order to select a list of all of the slide boxes in one. So because they're all in a class called slide box, we'll select it just like that. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to select the buttons. So we want to add event listeners towards each button individually, so we're going to have to create individual constants because they're not going to change. We'll create a constant for them, and then we're going to select it with query selector. Now the button the name that we have allocated these slide buttons to is called slide button, and then for the previous specifically it's called previous. So that means this button has two classes, so we'll name the first one slide button and then the second one previous. Then we'll do the same for next. Alright, so now the next thing that we want to do is we want to create a loop, a for loop, so that we can add an active class for the slides that are to show when the user first enters the website. The slide shouldn't just be shown only when the user clicks on the button. It should be shown directly when everything has been loaded. So we're going to use a for loop for this, and we're going to start with position 0. Alright, so now basically the length for this, or how long or how many items the active class should be applied to, should be a specific number that we can change, because we're going to be adding this number towards multiple functions in this JavaScript file, and instead of repeating it, for example, if it's 5 slides that should be shown at a time, then that means we shouldn't have to write the specific number 5, and then we're going to have to repeat that in other functions. And then when we want to change the number to, for example, 7 slides at a time, we're going to have to change all of them each manually. Instead, we're gonna have to create a constant outside this event listener domain, so that we can apply this number towards all functions that we're going to be adding. And so we want to make this variable global. So we're going to create a constant, and we're going to call this number of slides. So then when we want to change the number of slides that we want to display, it will be applied to all of them, and we don't have to manually change each and every we don't have to change the number in each and every function that we're going to be adding. So we want there to be 5 slides to be displayed, so we're going to add that length here, and then I should be incremented by 1. So now we are going to select the array that holds all the slides, called all slides, and then each position, but it only goes for 5 of those slides. We want to add an active class, and this active class, we're not going to be adding the properties through CSS, as we haven't added the CSS properties. We're going to add them through JavaScript. So now let's access the class list of each of these slide boxes, and then we're going to add an active class, and we're going to be using this active class in order to know which slides have the active class, and we're going to make changes later on. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to add an event listener to each of these 2 buttons, previous button and next button. So we're going to start with previous button. We're going to add an event listener, and the event that we want to listen for is for a click. Now when the previous button is clicked, we want it to be redirected to a function. Instead of adding the function here, we'd rather create a new function outside of this event, inside of this DOM console loaded domain. So we're going to just refer to the function that it should look for. So we're going to create an R function, and we could just state the name of the function that we want to include, that we want it to be executed. However, because it's going to have parameters, we're going to have to create an R function and then include the name of the function there. Whoops. So in curly brackets, the name of the function will be shift backward, and it's going to have 2 parameters. Each of these button functions are going to have 2 parameters. So the first one, we want to include the number of sliders, because we're going to use that number soon. So we're going to, instead of repeating it twice, instead of getting the number of sliders length, we're going to create a variable that will store this instead. So we're going to call this variable number of sliders, and then we want to get the number of sliders that there are in total. So we can do this by calling the length of the attribute length. So now we can just add the number of sliders variable, and then we're also going to be using the slides container as well. And then we also want to do the same thing for next. Alright, so for next button, it's called shift forward, and now we can, before we create our functions, we're also going to include one more function that we want to be executed before we work on the previous and next one functions, the shift backward and shift forward functions. We're going to include one called width size. So this will be the one that will modify what, or will determine what width that each slide will basically attain. So it's going to contain one parameter. It's going to pass in one parameter, and we are going to pass in the slides container. Alright, so now the first thing that we want to do is we want to create the width size function before we create the shift backward and shift forward function. Now the first thing that we want to do is select all of the slide boxes that have the active class so that we can act upon them, so that we can display them, because as of now they're still not displayed yet, and we can also determine the width size. So we're going to create active slides, which will store all of the slide boxes that have the active class, and so we're also going to add in the active class in this query. Alright, so now next thing we want to do is we want to also get the width of the slides container, and we're going to be working on the width later on, but we're using the width, we're selecting the width so that all the slide boxes, the number, no matter what number it is, they're always responsive to the width container. And also we're going to be creating a pattern where the last element, or the element to the furthest right, is the biggest, and the element to the furthest left is smallest, and everything in between is a descending width. So for example, it's biggest here, then it reduces until the one at the left is the smallest. But we're going to be creating this pattern later. So first we are going to create a variable, that a constant that will store it, the container width. And because we have already passed slides container, we can use this and we can add offset width. We can get its attribute through offset width so that we can get the width of the container. Now we're going to be creating this pattern later on, very soon. So now first thing we want to do is display our slides, as right now they're set to 0. So now we're going to start processing from the last element, the element being the one on the furthest right, so that we can determine, so that we can make it the biggest, and then as it continues from last to first, it becomes smaller. So we're going to first access the one at the right. And in order to access this, we're going to have to use active slides, get the length so that we can get the last element, the last position of active slides. However, we're going to subtract it by 1, since positioning starts from 0 rather than 1. And then we are also going to continue the loop until it reaches 0. So 0 should be the last position that active class that the loop works on, and it's going to be decrementing. So for example, in our case, since there are 5 slides, it will start from 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Now the next thing we're going to do is we want to access each element, and we are going to set the width for now, just for now, to 300 pixels, so that we can display all of our slides. So all of our slides are shown. However, I can see that the ones that are supposed to be hidden, they're still shown, and so we're going to have to work on slide box and CSS, and we're just going to add in one more property, which is overflow hidden. So then now we are not able to see any of the text, and also while we transition from a slide showing to a slide disappearing, we also want the text to have a smooth transition, because if we leave it as it is, when it transitions from slide being shown to slide being hidden, the image goes smoothly. The text, however, it's going to wrap itself, so we want to ensure that there's no wrapping of text, otherwise it will go from it will start to go downwards and it will start to form a column, but we want it to stay in a row. So we're going to add in another property as well called text wrap, and we want to ensure the text does not wrap, and this will be relevant later on. So now we can see that all of our slides are shown. So now let's work on the pattern. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to get the factorial. We're going to create the pattern. In order to do that, we're going to have to get the factorial of the integer of the number of slides there are. However, we're not going to be multiplying, we're going to be adding. And in order to achieve this, we are going to first create a counter variable called counterVar, and we're going to set this value to 0. Now we're going to create a loop. and it's going to start from 0. And now what we're going to do for factorial, you get an integer. If you want to get a factorial of an integer, you multiply from that integer to all of the integers that come below it, which is greater than 0. So for example, it's a factorial of 3, then 3 multiplies by 2, and 3 times 2 multiplies by 1, so it's like 3 times 2 times 1. If it's together factorial of 5, then it's 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So we want to do that, however, but for addition. So we're gonna have to do this by creating a loop, and we're going to determine how long this loop goes for. It should be up until the number of slides of display, which we have set on top. So we're going to specify that variable. So we want it to be 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, and there it ends. And we're going to increment, so we want it to start from 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 instead. So we're going to use the counter variable and we're going to add on to the variable, to the value that we get each time in the loop. However, we're going to start from 1 because we specified that positioning starts from 0. However, we wanted to start from 1 to 5 and not from 0 to 4, for example. So then this should be because we've added 1 to it, so then this should go from 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, which is what we want. And now whatever the total that we get, we're going to use this, and we're going to create a width multiplier. So then this width multiplier will be used to multiply with certain slide box according to the position it is in. So for example, if the width multiplier we get is, for example, 50, and the positioning starts from 1 to 5, we want to show slides from 1 to 5, so then it's going to be, for example, so it should go 50 times 5, 50 times 4, 50 times 3, 50 times 2, 50 times 1, and that will create a descending width size. So we're going to determine the width multiplier, and we want to ensure that whatever size we get, it is responsive to the container's width. So we're going to involve the container's width this time, and then divide it by the count variable that we get. So in our case, if the number of slides to display is 5, then the countervar that we get should be 5 plus 4, which is 9, 9 plus 3, which is 12, 12 plus 2, which is 14, 14 plus 1, which is 15, and then the container width, say it's maybe 600, so 600 divided by 15, and we will get the width multiplier, and we'll be able to multiply each slide box. So because of that, we are going to also, we're also going to create a new width, and we're going to assign it to 0 so that we can do the multiplication from there. So we're going to assign new width to width multiplier, and then we're going to multiply this width multiplier by the position. So however, we're going to add it by 1 since positioning starts from 0, so we're going to have to add I plus 1 in order to get the actual number that we want to get, which is 1 to 5 instead of 0 to 4. And now we're going to use that variable, and we're going to assign it to the width of each slide box. However, we're going to use backticks in order to store in this variable, assign it to this value, new width, whatever value that we get, and then because the width is going to be in pixels, we're going to add the string value pixels. So now when we check, we can see that the width is descending from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and there's a certain pattern that it follows.